Humanities, Episode 4, World Religions. We've considered primal religions, which tend to be localized, but this week we're going to look at religious traditions that spread far and wide. These are the world religions. Now, I've discussed Islam and Buddhism at length elsewhere, so this lecture is going to primarily focus on Judaism and Christianity. In the Western world, Judaism is the starting point from which Christianity and Islam will emerge. The central text from which the beliefs of the people will emerge is called Tanakh. This is a term derived from the three parts of the word and made from the first letters of each section's Hebrew name. And so you have the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Tanakh. The Torah is the laws. Sometimes referred to as the books of Moses. We also have the Nevim, which are the prophets. These are the major and minor prophets. And then the Ketubim, which are your basic writings or the histories of this tradition. And so, in essence, for those who are familiar with the Christian Bible, the Tanakh is really what we would call the Old Testament in Christianity, but it's taken in a different order. Whereas the Old Testament tries to take a sort of chronological approach, the Tanakh takes a more thematic approach. Now, the book is composed over a 1,000-year span from the 12th to the 2nd century. It's doubtful that much was actually written down prior to the 5th or 6th century BCE. Now, although the stories, of course, within it are often much older, the finalized version of the text, which we recognize today, is not canonized until the 2nd century CE. The basic hallmark of the Jewish faith, which differentiated it from the pagan traditions surrounding it, is explained in what's known as the Shema prayer, which comes from Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. So the God of the Hebrew people was a mystery deity, a being that was not connected to nature like the earlier pagan deities were. It was not a deity like those earlier figures that a person could see or touch or have, a direct contact with in that way. And it wasn't part of a pantheon. It was the only deity. And so the central hallmark of Judaism is going to be a very strict demand of monotheism, the idea that there is only one God. Now, of course, Judaism did not begin in this way. Within the Canaanite and the Levite culture from which it emerged, there were many gods and goddesses which were known, and this carries us into early Judaism. Looking into the book of Genesis, we see, for example, a distinction between El and Yahweh. And so you have some images presented there to you, some of the ancient sculpturing. So there's an image of El sitting there on the throne. So you can see it very much like one of those early pagan figures. So we also see another figure called Baal, which is mentioned in a rather derogatory fashion throughout the Bible. And then, of course, Yahweh, who becomes sort of the central deity that is responsible for creation. In addition, Yahweh was a male deity who had a female counterpart called Asherah, just as we find within many of the Eastern or Egyptian traditions. And so this ancient depiction here demonstrates the figure of Yahweh with Asherah together. And so the male and the female aspect of the divine in unison. And so this was sort of the the origins, the beginnings of it. And there's going to be a struggle within this faith, but around the United Kingdom period, roughly about 1000 BCE, that's when Judaism becomes fully monotheistic. There is one male God, Yahweh. Yahweh is that central figure. He is the God of the people. But tradition comes to hold that the name of God is sacred and it should not be pronounced. So many people will simply say Hashem, or the name, rather than making reference to the term Yahweh. Now, many great stories are relayed through the pages of the Tanakh. It begins with two very distinct creation myths. In Genesis chapter 1, it talks of God's creation of the universe in 6 days. This is a tradition that brings humanity into existence on the sixth day, fully formed and equal. The man and the woman, all of humanity are brought into being, just as all of the animals were brought into being, just as all of the plant life were brought into being before. So we see a sense of equality in that original story. But in Genesis 2:3, we hear about the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now there is one human who is being born. He is being given to a female counterpart. But this female counterpart is being portrayed in Genesis 2:3 as being somehow lesser, as being somehow inferior to the male, to Adam. And so it's showing a hierarchy that's starting to come into play that wasn't there in the original story from Genesis 1. Now, there's a lot of interesting things on that, and I'm going to give you a link to a video here shortly, which, well, actually, it's pictured right there at the bottom of the screen. It's called A Brief History of Feminism, Part 1, and it kind of really goes into a lot of interesting detail on how this original equality got twisted into the patriarchal view that we perceive now. So if you're interested, give that a watch. We've already mentioned this, but in Genesis 6, we learn about the Great Flood, which we mentioned in connection to the Epic of Gilgamesh, recognizing that Judaism, like many traditions, are going to have a story about a great flood that washes away everything, and all the corruption is gone, and now we can start fresh, we can start anew. But of course, we come to recognize, unfortunately, that we can wash away all of that sin and corruption, but because we are human beings with free will, it's simply going to come back again. We are, as Heraclitus told us, in a changing, fleeting world, a world of constant flux. Genesis will also introduce us to the figure of Abraham, who will become recognized as the father of all three Western religions. And so I wanted to show you the basic lineage here. In the city of Ur, roughly about 1800 BC, this is a pagan culture. And there is a individual called Terah who was responsible for making the clay idols that people would buy as statuary to put into their homes of these various deities. Now he has a son called Abram, and there's a story that comes to us not from the Torah, but rather from another important Jewish work called the Talmud, which tries to fill in some of the gaps or help to explain some of the issues in the Tanakh in more detail. But anyway, we're told that when Abram is about 14 years old, his father left him alone to mind the idol shop while he was away on business. And when the father comes back, his father discovers that all of the idols in his shop have been smashed. They've been destroyed, all except for the one largest one. And of course, he's very distraught. He's very upset by this because that's where the family makes their money. And he demands of Abram what's happened. And Abram says, well, this one largest deity, it got angry, it got jealous, it destroyed all of the others. Well, Terah doesn't buy that for a minute. He knows that these figures are clay and water. He knows that there is no real divinity or power behind them, which means that he doesn't actually even believe in his own traditions. That's the point Abram was trying to make. Even at that young age, he had already sort of started to receive this message from a being that is out there, from that one true God, if you will. And he's trying to help his father to see that these pagan myths are illusion, and he knows that there's no reality behind them. Well, anyway, when Abram rather gets older, he marries a woman called Sarai, and together they have a covenant. When a person enters into a covenant with God within this tradition, they take on new names. And so Abram became Abraham, Sarai became Sarah or Sarah. And God promised that a child would be born to them and that that child will be the founder of a great nation. But they wait and wait and wait, and they get older and older, and no child ever comes. Well, eventually, Sarah begins to believe that maybe this prophecy only refers to Abraham and not to her. And so she allows Abraham to lie with her handmaiden, Hagar, and very quickly they produce a child which they call Ishmael. Now it's Ishmael's lineage which is going to lead down to Muhammad and therefore the founding of Islam. But then later we're told that when Abraham is 99 years old and Sarah is 90, a child is born to them, and that is Isaac. And Isaac's lineage will lead down to King David, as well as eventually to Jesus. And so the Jewish and Christian traditions emerge from Isaac, whereas the Islamic tradition emerges from Ishmael. So we get that story of how these figures come into play. Of course, one of the biggest events in the life and in the story of Abraham is what's known as the Akedah, or the ritual binding of Isaac, where God demands Isaac to be taken to Mount Moriah and sacrificed, which Abraham does. Although he's not allowed to sacrifice him, it was enough to show that he was willing to do so. It demonstrated his sense of faith. Again, this is a story that I've talked about in detail in other places, so I won't go on with that now. Beginning around Genesis 35, we are introduced to the 12 sons of Jacob. And these 12 sons, the names they bear, become the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asherah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. When people know about this today, they recognize it probably from the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which is a very popularist piece, but it's based upon, the story of these 12 brothers and how Jacob had a tendency to favor Joseph above all of the others, the jealousy that breeds, and so on. And so you may be familiar with it in that particular respect. I also mention that because it demonstrates, again, how these stories stick with us, how they remain. And now here we are, into the 20th century. You have a great musical theater genius who is responsible for reviving it and retelling this story in a rather humorous and lavish fashion. Well, of course, they will sell Joseph into slavery into Egypt to get rid of him, but he rises through the ranks and becomes the right-hand man of the Pharaoh himself. And all of this takes place somewhere around 1700 BCE. Now, when famine hits the Canaanite lands, it is going to force them into Egypt looking for food. And this is what is known as the Exodus, the entrance into Egypt. And then in the book of Exodus, we get the story of Moses, which many of you know from the Ten Commandments movie that plays at Easter every year. But we get the story of Moses and the Exodus, the leaving from Egypt. and this takes place roughly about 1350 BCE. So the story is that the Jewish peoples were held in bondage in Egypt for about 400 years until Moses comes and frees them. And this story becomes a major defining feature of the Jewish faith, which is recited yearly during Passover. Now, of course, Judaism, like all religious traditions, seeks to offer a moral compass. Within the Torah, there are 613 commandments, which are known as the mitzvot. Every time the God speaks within the Torah, every time he gives any type of instruction, it is considered a commandment. So there's 613 in total. But there are 10 that stand out. These are known as the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. The first half deal with our relationship to God, but the second half deals with our moral relationship to each other. It's about that interconnection of humanity. And so we get these basic moral rules. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. These basic rules become a foundation for all three of the Western faiths and are really found within every tradition within the world. Now, I would love to spend the rest of this course talking you through Tanakh. There's just so much of interest within it, but we need to move on. So I will conclude here by saying that Judaism does evolve over the course of time, goes through many ups and downs, and it eventually finds itself under the domain of Rome. And that's where the story of Christianity begins during the 1st century CE. But in 135 CE, the Jewish people are going to be expelled after an uprising by the Romans. They will be expelled from their ancestral homeland, and they will scatter throughout the empire and beyond. This is what is referred to officially as the diaspora, the dispersal of the Jewish people, or more accurately, the galut, the forced exile of the Jewish people. And this is one of the reasons, one of the major reasons actually, why Jews become attacked, why they become scapegoats down throughout history, is the fact that from 135 onwards, they have no homeland. They are always the foreigner, the outsider in any country that they move into. And so this is where, a lot of the major problems for the Jewish people will begin. But for now, let's turn to Christianity, which began as a cult of Judaism within the 1st century CE. Since the Jewish nation was held by Rome, the people were, recognizing themselves as being under occupation. And so the promise of a Messiah, someone who would come to lead them to victory, to deliver them from their oppressors, this was often heard. And there were many, many messiahs who came forward, all of which generally recognized as proving false. But because they were looking for someone who could liberate them from their oppressors, most people assumed that the Messiah would be a military leader. So when Jesus comes around as this very humble individual, he wasn't widely accepted. I mean, certainly there were people who migrated towards him. Certainly he gained a following. But in the wide society, he was not overly accepted, because how could this man of peace be an individual who leads us towards victory on the battlefield? They were looking for a military leader. But nonetheless, the rise of the tradition given his name, Christianity, would eventually go on to become the largest religion in the world. Of the 8 billion people that populate the planet right now, over 2 billion of them, more than a quarter, consider themselves to be Christians. Now remember that through the 1st century, this is still the Hellenistic period. Throughout the Roman Empire, Greek was the dominant language for the educated people. The term Messiah in Greek is Christos, or Christ, and this is where the term Christianity is derived from. Now, we learn about the figure of Jesus through the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first four books of what becomes known as the New Testament, which will eventually comprise 27 books in total. And I would invite you at this point to watch my video, Religious Ethics in the Western Faiths, Part 2, to learn some rather interesting facts about Jesus' life and a detailed look at the Sermon on the Mount, which we just do not have time for here. But I did want to take a moment to point out the images that you see on the screen. These are just a sampling of some of the images that have been created of Jesus over the years. He has become a figure that is so often found within the art of the humanities. It's really fascinating, I think, to go back and consider that he was not, such a widely recognized figure within his own life, but because of the growth of Christianity, he ends up becoming this figure that we see everywhere. But the depictions are often quite different. And so you notice one that a lot of Protestant churches today will use, which we see this one here. Sort of here is this man of peace, if you will. But here we see a piece of Byzantine art where Jesus is perceived like a saint, and you'll notice the little circle around his head there, this little act of the halo. And then, of course, within Catholicism particularly, the idea of the crucifixion, the way his life ends through this terrible Roman form of torture, this crucifixion, is going to become a central aspect of art. And then for those, we've mentioned it before, but for those who are not familiar with it, this is what the symbol of the Chi-Rho looks like. And so what you have are the letters Chi and Rho, the first two letters of Christos, joined together in that stylistic fashion. In this particular one, we also see the Greek letter Alpha and Omega, the first and the last letters of the alphabet, implying that Christ is both the beginning and the end of all things. Now, after the Romans crucified Jesus, his followers are going to be persecuted, and they go into hiding. In the book of Acts, specifically chapter 9, we hear the story of a tax collector called Saul, who was persecuting the Jews. En route to Damascus, he was given a vision of Jesus which will transform him. The vision left him blind with scales over his eyes. But when the scales fell away, he saw very clearly, and he embraced Christ, and he became his strongest advocate. In covenantal fashion, his name was changed to Paul. So again, we kind of see the journey of the hero motif played out in the story of Saul becoming Paul. Paul will begin the evangelical process, which is going to take Christianity beyond its borders into other parts of the world. He will travel. He writes letters, which are going to make up a good chunk of the New Testament. He puts on his life on the line, and he works tirelessly to spread the message of Christianity to other parts of the Mediterranean world. However, as traditions spread beyond their original territory, they also change. They must assimilate into that new culture. For example, all indication is that Jesus was born in late spring, but the date of his birth is set at the 25th of December, because in the pagan world there were many holidays around the winter solstice, the darkest part of the year. During these times, people are to pray for and usher in the return of the sun, S-U-N. But in Christianity, Jesus is the sun, S-O-N. He is the light. And so now, this is a time to herald the return of the sun, the return of Christ through the process of birth. And so the idea was that you would assimilate your ideas into the culture that you were trying to get to accept your views. Because it's, almost impossible to say, let's take everything you know and completely throw it away. Here's something new. Believe this. That doesn't work. But if you can find ways of taking your beliefs and assimilating them into what's already there, it's much easier to bring about those converts. And that's a big part of what Paul did. And so he is really more responsible than anyone for the spread of Christianity during the first century. In Europe, the influence of Greek philosophy is very strongly felt, and the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus's views are going to be felt very strongly within Christianity. For example, in the book of John. As Christianity came into its own, a chasm began to form between Christianity and its parent faith of Judaism. And the book of John, which is written near the end of the first century, drives this home by rewriting Genesis in its opening chapters. And it does so to show that Christ has always been present within the Godhead. Even before the act of creation, Christ was there. This is where the concept of the Trinity is derived, that God is more than one thing, but rather has three elements comprised within it: the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, three aspects of the same entity, deity, the same form. Now, read in a certain light, what John is effectively saying is that God has always been Christian. And if you look at this piece of artwork here, which is supposed to depict the creation, you'll notice that the figure that is here in the act of creation, this is not an ancient deity. This is not a God-like figure. This is Jesus. And he is there. He is present within that moment before the act of creation. And as it's all being brought into existence, as it's all coming into being, he is there. He is present. And so Christianity, the concept of Christ, these are not new ideas, John is trying to say. They have always been there. And so let's go back and place him into the original gospel at Genesis 1. Let's rewrite the Bible from the beginning and make sure that it is a Christian document. That's what the book of John really tries to do. And it does so very effectively, and it drives that wedge very strongly between Judaism and Christianity, so much so that, of course, they're going to be at odds for much of the rest of their history. Now, Christianity grew up in hiding through persecution until the Roman Emperor Constantine comes to power in the early 4th century. In 313 CE, Constantine is going to enact what's known as the Edict of Milan. This was a blanket statement of religious tolerance, which allows Christianity to practice openly, to organize, to build churches, to hold religious meetings, all of that stuff that they couldn't really do openly before because their faith was outlawed, because they were being persecuted. Now, after the Edict of Milan, the Christians, along with every other faith within the empire, had that freedom to be able to express themselves and to worship openly. Constantine did this largely because he felt that he could use this growing tradition of Christianity as a way of strengthening his empire. But unfortunately, Christianity was far from organized because it never had the chance to do so before. And so you had one group of people who may have only had one of the Gospels. Another group of people over here may have only had one or two of Paul's letters, each one growing up with a different aspect of it. And so there was a lot of controversy. What is Christianity? And so in 325, Constantine will call what's known as the Council of Nicaea. And the Council of Nicaea was given the task of settling these issues and establishing an orthodox view of Christianity. What does it mean to be a Christian? What are the basic beliefs? And this was eventually established through what becomes known as the Nicene Creed, which you can see on the screen there. But it lays down a lot of the basic tenets. It accepts the fact that Jesus has a supernatural birth, the virgin birth. It accepts the idea that he is a divine entity, not just a human teacher or a rabbi, but a divine entity. It establishes the concept of the Trinity as being the truth. So a lot of these ideas that were controversial before now become established as orthodoxy. And those who accepted this view, they would be the true Christians. And those who rejected it, they were the heretics, and they would be prosecuted accordingly. With the support of Rome, Christian influence is going to grow. And near the end of the century in 392, the Emperor Theodosius will declare Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, when the western half of the empire fell in 526 CE, the eastern half, centered in Constantinople, continued. Those in the western half followed what came to be known as Catholic Christianity, those in the eastern half Byzantine or later Orthodox Christianity. There were many groups that didn't follow either one, the so-called heretics. These people promoted different views, and they were persecuted because of it. The Gnostics, a term which implies knowledge, were a prime example. Now, I have a fascinating 10-part series on Gnosticism on the Moral World YouTube channel that I would invite you to view if you have an interest in learning more about these traditions. But the Gnostics were absolutely fascinating people who didn't see the crucifixion as the end. It was the beginning of the story. Before we leave this screen, I just wanted to point out to you on the maps that you see there, the first one over here, where you see all of this colored in, at its height, that was the Roman Empire in the first century. And so you see it spreading from Hadrian's Wall down through Britannia into Gaul, the Italian peninsula, of course, southern Europe, which includes the Hellenistic world, over into the Middle East, down into Egypt, all the way through northern Africa, up into the Iberian Peninsula. The whole Mediterranean world, even a little outpost up here, was the Roman Empire. But by the time we come to its collapse, you'll notice that it had already shrunk dramatically, with many of these northern tribes reclaiming their own territories. And so it was really focused just down here along the Mediterranean. And you'll see also that there is that split that takes place between the western and the eastern portions. And it is the Western Empire that falls in 525 officially. Of course, it's a long-going process, and Rome's influence is still felt for long after that, but the official date of the collapse is at 525. But then this Byzantine Empire is going to continue at least until Islam grows, and then it comes to take over and dominate much of that territory. Okay. The third Western faith is Islam, which begins in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, as mentioned at the start, I do have a detailed look at this tradition already available to you on the Moral World channel, and so I would invite you to take a look at that. It's called Religious Ethics in the Western Faiths, Part 3, Quran 17:22 through 39. And so that'll give you the details of anything that you may be interested in with regards to that. Islam will expand to incorporate the Middle East and Northern Africa, while Christianity holds sway in Europe. And this division, we'll see, is going to come into play very strongly in the second millennium, when these two factions end up going to war, largely over control of the Holy Land. And of course, we're also expected in this section to consider the East, where there's a similar growth occurring. Just as Christianity became an evangelical tradition which separated itself from its parent faith of Judaism, Buddhism will become an evangelical movement, critiquing its parent faith of Hinduism. So again, I direct you to another video of interest, Buddhism, the True Self is No Self. Now, even if you watch all of the suggested videos, this is only scratching the surface of what is out there. Religion is such a fascinating area of study, and one that's hugely influential on the humanities and the human race in general. So I hope that what you're given here is going to, at the very least, whet your appetite to do your own investigations and try to learn more into these fascinating areas. Of course, there's a lot on my Moral World YouTube channel. There's a lot of other interesting things out there on video as well. There are tons of books available to you, but there's just so much of interest in this area. So I'll just wish you happy exploring, and we'll leave it at that.